Good evening, everyone. And welcome to the March 2024 Council Agenda Briefing. We acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and their elders past and present. I would like to advise everyone that the audio of this meeting is being live streamed to YouTube. I request everyone to turn off their mobile phones. I remind you that audio recording of the meeting proceedings and photography within the chamber is prohibited unless prior approval has been granted, and councillors and city officers are reminded to disclose any declarations of financial interests and interests affecting impartiality, and are requested to activate their microphones when addressing the meeting. So, with that, welcome to everyone. Item 1 is the declaration of opening, and I declare this meeting open at 6 p.m. Items for Council. Agenda items 2, 3, 6, 7, 8.1, 8.2, 9, 11, 13 and 14 will be dealt with at the ordinary council meeting to be held 26 March 2024. That brings us to item 4, which is attendance. Item 4.1 is apologies. I haven't received any apologies for this meeting. I do understand that Councillor Cridland is running a little bit late and will be with us very shortly. Item 4.2 is approved leaves of absence, and there are no approved leaves of absence for this evening. Item 5 is declarations of interest. I haven't received any declarations of interest. Does anyone have any declarations of interest that they wish to make this evening? That's a no. Okay. Item 8 is presentations. Item 8.3 is deputations. And this evening we have 4 speakers who will have up to 10 minutes to address council. I'd like to begin by inviting Ms. Stephanie Buckland of Amana Living in Subiaco, who is speaking for the officer recommendation at item 10.1.1. Welcome to you, Ms. Buckland. The microphone is yours.
Thank you. Good evening. As the Mayor said, I'm Stephanie Buckland, the Chief Executive Officer of Amana Living. I'm presenting this deputation in support of the City Officer's recommendation that Council adopt the business plan for the disposal of Collier Park Village, pursuant to Section 3.59 of the Local Government Act 1995, for the purposes of public advertising. Amana Living is the City's preferred proponent for the proposed transaction, and we acknowledge that the business plan is required to transfer Collier Park Village, as this is considered to be a major land transaction under the Local Government Act. In October 2023, the Council endorsed Amana Living as the preferred proponent following an assessment of our submission to the request for proposal process. Amana Living is one of the largest not-for-profit providers of accommodation, care and services for older Western Australians. We have been in existence for more than 60 years, and we are committed to the highest standards of care and support and customer service. Should the transaction come to fruition, Collier Park Village would help to advance Amana Living's mission, which is to enable older people to maintain their individuality, providing what is needed to lead a fulfilling life. The Collier Park Village is consistent with our strategic intent to develop a number of integrated care communities, offering a range of accommodation, service, and care options to support residents to maintain their independence, social connectivity, health, and wellness as they progress through the aging process. Amana Living and the City of South Perth have recently finalised a heads of agreement, which includes our commitments to the criterion in the request for proposal process and provides the key terms for the proposed transaction. In some cases, Amana Living has gone beyond what was expected in the request for proposal, including, for example, the protection of residents' tenure. Through our consultation with residents, we recognised that existing residents have concerns about their future security of tenure, especially residents who rent. To address this, we resolved that all existing residents, whether rental or lease for life, will be entitled to security of tenure in perpetuity. The heads of agreement also includes Amana Living's obligations in relation to any future redevelopment of the village, including to consult with residents on redevelopment proposals and a commitment to provide for maximum retention of existing trees on the site. Amana Living recently completed a comprehensive due diligence assessment of Collier Park Village, and our board is satisfied with the outcomes of this process. On the transfer of the village, Amana Living would assume responsibility for the net liability amount of $21.8 million, which is the amount included in the business plan. We're hopeful that the transfer will occur and that the residents of Collier Park Village will become part of the Amana Living community. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your deputation, Ms Buckland. Councillors, do we have any questions for Ms Buckland this evening? I might ask one. You've already answered it, but I suppose just to underscore it, I do understand that Amana came to the village and put on a couple of presentations for the benefit of the residents, and the question of the security of tenure, which you have answered already, particularly for rentals, came up. Just so that everyone is in no doubt, can you let us know what the undertakings or the commitments given to residents vis-a-vis their tenure was?
Yeah, so you're right. A number of the residents were concerned about security of tenure. They had questions about that, particularly those who had were on the rental arrangement. And what we committed to the residents, and this is included as a provision in the heads of agreement, and I expect it will be included in a sale agreement if it goes forward, is that we will provide for all residents to have security of tenure, whether they're a lease for life resident or whether they are a rental resident.
Thank you so much. Councillors, any further questions for Ms Buckland this evening? No. Thank you very much for your deputation. I'd now like to invite Mr Bill Gleeson of South Perth, who is speaking for the officer recommendation at item 10.4.3. Welcome, Mr Gleeson. The microphone is yours. You have 10 minutes.
Mr Mayor, councillors, excuse me. Once upon a time, 1987-88, 36 years ago, a ratepayer of the City of South Perth, a businessman, he ran a service station at Leigh Street and Manning Road. He also was the president of the RSL and a member of the City of South Perth Bicentennial Committee. His name was Bill McGee. He put a proposal to the Bicentennial Committee to put a war memorial, a scale model of the Kings Park Memorial, to be located at the Civic Centre Gardens, Sandgate Street in South Perth. Funding was successful, $8,000. The memorial was unveiled by Mayor George Burnett, March 1988. That was quite an achievement, all done within 2 years. Bill McGee, nominated in 1996 for the local government election in the Manning Ward, he won. This is a prime example of a person, a John citizen, who had a vision, a war memorial that will last forever. His name is on the honour board, but is now gathering dust in the dungeons of the library. Behind those walls, Mr Mayor, there's possibly over $100,000 worth of mural oil paintings. It's probably about 8. The public have never seen those oil paintings, never. The city wants to paint the walls, and I quote, with paintings representing the City of South Perth in some sort of mural form. Well, I suggest, Mr Mayor, that we stop painting mural. I would ask the city to stop spending large amounts of money on mural photos that cannot be seen, put them back down in the dungeons where the other honour boards are, and paint those walls with the same mural. or as the other suggestion, Mr Mayor, is that this city have one day a year, call it an open day, an information centre, open up the council chamber, this area here, to show the mural paintings, the honour boards in the reception area, once a year, have staff here telling the city about the history of South Perth. That's how people can see and hear the history of the South Perth. An example of what the past councillors did for the city for over 80 years. They did it on an honorary basis. They didn't get paid. They didn't even have a meal. They came here, were people that were on the committee for the South Perth Hospital, the Como Retirement Village and the Collier Golf Course. No one got paid as an elected member back in those days. Those people had a lot of time and spent a lot of time and hours sitting around this table. There was 15 elected members in those days, and it was hotly debated, lots of things, and discussed, and everything was built and paid for, and it was very successful. All those councils of the past are part of the history of the city of South Perth. They were on the honour board. A lot of councillors here have probably never seen the honour boards. They were taken down about probably 10 years ago or 5. And I would like to have them put back, and the paintings of former councillors put back, so that people that do go in that room on Anzac Day, Remembrance Day, and maybe the day, an open day for the city, so people can come and be told what the city is all about, can enjoy the history of the city of South Perth. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Gleeson. Councillors, do we have any questions for Mr Gleeson today? No. Thank you very much for your deputation, Mr Gleeson. I'd now like to invite Ms Bronwyn David of South Perth, who is speaking against the officer recommendation at item 10.4.3. Welcome to you, Ms David. The microphone is yours. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Mayor, councillors and city administration staff. Another Tuesday night, another opportunity to talk to you about trees. I'd like to take you back to another Tuesday night in February, the Electors' General Meeting, and address a couple of the motions that are listed there in item 10.4.1. I know the Mayor was frustrated that night at the number of times he had to hear about trees, and I share the frustration. I wish I didn't have to come before you to talk about trees. The best solution to what the community wants and needs is for the state government to show some leadership and protect mature trees from destruction during development, as happens so seamlessly in many other states. Unfortunately, the state government won't let me speak to them, so I come to you instead. Maybe if anyone here finds themselves in the big house on the hill, they could put in a good word for trees. I raised a motion at the Electors' General Meeting urging the city to try to find a way to implement the tree protection measures that were put forward in our draft local planning scheme number 7, following the Planning Minister's rejection of those measures and his clear language that he was not going to allow this city or any other to have those tree protection measures. So I'm delighted that a councillor has acted so quickly to bring a tree protection measure forward and commend the intent of the motion to you. You will also know that the West Australian Local Government Association has researched this question and developed a model local planning policy to protect trees. So with all that information and the support of the community, I'm sure that the city can arrive at a local planning policy that protects trees. As the city has pointed out in the agenda, there were many community responses to the proposed tree protections in LPS 7, and the responses were overwhelmingly positive. After this last summer and the heat waves, there may be even more support now for tree protection measures. Another motion that came up during the electors' general meeting was to do with the urban forest strategy of the city. It was asked when this the strategy would be forthcoming, given that the previous strategy is now out of date. It seems from the city's answer that there hasn't been a lot of progress, and I know one of our councillors sought extra money in last year's budget to assist the process, and already we're racing towards the end of yet another financial year. It seems that only a document review and collation of information has been done so far. Of course, I think it should be a priority. I would hope that you would think it would be a priority as well, given that the existing strategy is out of date, is getting hotter, and our canopy cover continues to decline. The motion at the meeting sought a project outline and timeline, and I'm wondering if they are available, whether they will ever be available, and I would really hope that the community could have some visibility of that. There was another, one of the other motions about trees was motion number 5 regarding street tree management. The answer given was that the street tree management plan would be considered as part of the urban forest strategy. That's the urban forest strategy for which we have no timeline. But the street tree matters are urgent, given that the canopy is declining and the only land, apart from reserves, of course, on which the city can have any input on developing canopy is the street trees. On that foot, restricting the use of verge parking for, restricting the use of verges for parking, which I understand is not permitted in the Canning Bridge Activity Centre plan area, should, in my view, be extended across the whole of the local government area. It's not appropriate to allow public land to be used to address parking shortfalls in private developments. The street tree management plan motion also proposed that where approval to remove a street tree is sought, that this be decided by the council and not the city administration. This would provide greater public visibility of decisions to remove street trees and give the appropriate weight to these decisions, reflecting the importance of the canopy cover these trees provide. This has not been adequately addressed in the response to the motion. The response to the motion also did not address the recommendation that when a tree is removed, the amenity dollar value that the adjoining landowner pays the city is then allocated to the street tree budget rather than the general budget. I understand that that is in fact policy, but that does not in fact happen. I think it's a reasonable expectation that the community would have that where you're taking away a tree and getting money in return, then that money should be used to replace the tree. So here endeth my weekly lecture on trees. Thank you again for listening to me.
Thank you, Ms David. Councillors, do we have any questions for Ms David this evening? No. Thank you very much for your deputation. We now invite Ms Catherine Brady of Kensington, who is speaking for the notice of motion at item 12.2. Welcome, Ms Brady. The microphone is yours. You have 10 minutes.
Great. First time up here, so be kind to me. Good evening, councillors, mayor and the people that are listening at home. My name is Kate Brady and I live in Kensington, and tonight I'd like to speak as a member of the South Perth Tree Canopy Committee, which is a subcommittee of the WA Tree Canopy Advocates. We formed in May 2022. Our aim is to advocate for the protection of trees, both on public and private land, as well as increasing tree canopy in the city of South Perth. Tree canopy is such an important part of our environment, and as a mother of 3 young children, I really worry about what our city is going to look like in years to come without tree protection. As South Perth tree canopy advocates and as a person, I want our city to be resilient, I want it to be livable, and I want it to be a leader in urban infill for all the right reasons. I want people to look back and go, man, they did a great job, and they had high density. So I want all of those things, and I think that we can achieve it, but I'm not sure we can do that without tree protection. As you can see in the agenda, and other people have said this as well, that we had a great response to tree protection in LPS 7, with 79% of respondents supporting tree protection on private land. And it was like super, super disappointing that we didn't get any tree protection in LPS 7 and it was taken out by the minister, especially when the community is so concerned about this, and we've been having such terrible heat wave and a changing of the climate. So, you know, I think that it's really important that we, if without state legislation, that we go down a path of getting a local planning policy that protects our trees on private land. We do have a declining tree canopy, and it's felt in our community after a very long hot summer, and now it's pretty hot in March. And as a group, we're getting more and more members and more community wanting tree protection of large trees on private property. Trees belong to all of us. They provide shade, cooling, habitat, clean air, and everyone needs them, and everyone should have access to suburbs with tree canopy. In relation to motion 12.2, Tree Protection and Urban Forest Advisory Group, we fully support the city drafting a planning policy that protects trees and requires the lodgement of a development application to remove large trees on private land. We also support a community engagement through the Urban Forest Advisory Group or Committee. South Perth Tree Canopy advocates would love to have meaningful input into the urban forest strategy and to have representatives at such committee. In summary, the introduction of a local planning policy to retain and protect trees is needed. It's needed urgently and it's needed now. We know that Perth has had a really hot summer and it has the lowest canopy cover in the country. Yet we are the only state without protection of trees on private property. We know that 80% of tree loss in Perth is occurring on private property. While the city steps up planning on public land, it cannot compensate for this loss. In 2020, the city of South Perth had only 17% tree canopy cover, and this will likely have declined over time. 4 years is a long time, and we all know that trees have been cut down a lot. So, yeah. We've also had the polyphagus shot hole borer, and I personally lost one of a significant tree that was 80 years old, a box elder on my property, which is really devastating, provide a huge amount of canopy, had a massive trunk, and it's pretty out of control and we're going to lose a lot more trees. So we need to protect the trees we do have because it's not looking good. We're going to lose trees in Hyde Park, we've lost trees in the zoo, Kim Beasley's lost a couple of trees on his land, everyone's lost trees. This is really concerning. And if we don't have protection and policies in place to just put a pause, just say, hey, before you go and just bulldoze the whole block, let's just take a pause. That minute when you're going to lose your plot and you're 6 o'clock, you've got 3 children screaming at you, saying, hey, and sometimes you just want to go, oh my goodness, kids, you have to take that pause. And it's the same with developing any sort of block. If we actually take a pause and you have to fill in a form and say, should we really be knocking down a tree that's 100 years old? Should we be knocking down a tree that's 60 years old? If we plant another tree today, most of us won't be here to see it into fruition. And it has value, and we should pause. And that's all that the tree advocate groups are asking for, is to think before we just allow us to knock down. So I really urge the council to work together as a uniformed group to kind of put the community first, and remember also that we currently have no tree protection. So individually you might go, hey, look, I would do it this way or I'd do it that way, but look at what's in front of you. And, you know, we think that this is a really good start and it's something. So I would really encourage you to vote for the best outcome for our future generations of the City of South Perth residents. Vote yes to the city preparing a local planning policy to protect large trees, and really think about, you know, how this will impact. So yeah, that's my deputation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for your deputation. Councillors, do we have any questions for Ms Brady this evening? Councillor Brenda Abrandis.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you very much for your deputation, Ms Brady. I've got a question with regard to your thoughts on one of the powers or duties that would be considered by the committee, and that's the second dot point, which refers to assist in the creation of opportunities to increase appropriate native endemic species for planting to support our natural ecosystem. The reason why I'm asking that is because I am quite concerned, in particular with regard to the black cockatoos.
Yep.
A significant amount of their food source that they've adapted to over the time is the pine plantation.
Yep.
And also the Cape lilac trees,
Yes.
and macadamias and other non-native, non-endemic species as well. So I'm concerned.
Councillor Brenda Abrandis, just a reminder that we're asking questions rather than making statements, so perhaps if you can keep it short and succinct as per the standing orders.
Sure, thanks, Mr Mayor. I was just providing context to the question. So my concern is with regard to that dot point,
Yes.
and the significance with regard to non-native, non-endemic species. What are your thoughts with regard to that, and is that dot point appropriate or should it be expanded?
Look, I don't know all the rules with council, so you guys are obviously the experts, and obviously the city are experts in relation to policy building. My personal view is that tree canopy comes in many forms, and we don't just go and get rid of trees because they're not endemic. If they grow well here and they provide habitat and food for animals, you know, I don't have a problem with that. Whether the policy needs to say, you know, to take things into consideration, I definitely would support. I think our preference should be that we should do endemic native plants, because usually they do better. But with our changing climate, that might not always be the case. And so we need to look at it in a holistic approach to say, what is the best for this environment? Because this environment isn't the same as it was 70 years ago. And we need to go and have a look at experts and, well, talk to experts and say, hey guys, what do you think would be the best for the environment? I guess from an advocacy point of view on tree canopy, what I'm for is cooling of our suburbs, providing habitat and food for the native fauna and flora, because then we get a situation that, you know, we're working harmoniously in our environment. But the semantics of like whether we should have native versus you know, non-native, you know, I think that that's something that should be investigated in the policy, but I'm not sure that we should be caught up with it at potentially at a council level of saying no to a policy being written and drafted. I think that the policy should be drafted and then it should be worked out what needs to go into that policy. That would be my thing. Thank you for asking a question. Love it. Anyone else got anything? I'm ready.
Thank you very much. Councillors, does anyone else have any questions for Ms Brady this evening? No. Okay. Thank you very much for your deputation.
Thank you.
I'll now move on to item 10, which is the draft March reports. But just before I hand you over to the Chief Executive Officer, I wasn't counting, but I think we've had about 80 questions come through to the administration already, which have been answered and the answers provided to Council at large. Certainly don't want to discourage anyone from asking questions, that's great. But if your question has been asked and you're satisfied with the answer, do consider whether or not it needs to be asked again. Not all questions need to be asked at the council agenda briefing. So with that, I'll turn you over to the Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Mike Bradford, to take you through the balance of the draft March reports.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Item 10.1.1, Collier Park Village Business Plan. The purpose of this report is for Council to consider a business plan for the disposal of Collier Park Village pursuant to Section 3.59 of the Local Government Act 1995.
Thank you, Mr. Bradford. Councillors, do we have any questions for the administration on this item this evening? Councillor Choi.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And yes, I did ask numerous questions on notice, but I will not be asking all those questions here this evening, because I do have some of those responses in front of me. So just to clarify, so we have heard a deputation this evening from Amana Living. Thank you very much. That was wonderful to hear. And welcome here this evening. I was wondering if Council may receive an update on its negotiations with the proposed new owner-operator for the Collier Park Village, Amana Living Incorporated. Is there anything further the CEO can comment on?
Mr. Bradford.
I might make a comment and then ask Director Shaw to fill in. I mean, the one thing I can mention is the heads of agreement's been executed, and that will be on the hub either today or tomorrow.
Ms. Shaw, anything to add?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. No, but this is the executed copy that we've just received, so that'll be on the hub. If Council resolves to proceed with the business plan, we have a draft notice ready to provide the statewide notice, which is for a period of 6 weeks. And if that occurs, then we're intending to have the report back to Council by the May ordinary council meeting, hopefully for agreement and consideration of those submissions and to enter into a contract for the disposal of the village. So that's the timeline we're working towards at this point in time.
I just might add that the heads of agreement is just that, it's a heads of agreement. It doesn't actually contemplate every single item to be agreed and in the sale of business contract, and that's still to be worked through.
Thank you, Ms. Shaw and Mr. Bradford. Councillors, any further questions on this item? Councillor Navard.
Mr. Mayor, I'll just answer a couple of the questions that I have found in the past have caused anxiety, so we can just be perfectly clear about some of those aspects. Is the accommodation intended for people over 55? Because in the officer's report, it was not exactly clear on page 6 regarding that explanation.
Ms. Shaw, should I send that your way? Or Mr. Adams? Mr. Adams.
Yep, so the conditional freehold requirements will be that the accommodation is for people over 55 years of age, and that any services that are provided on the site are primarily for the support of persons residing on the land. So that would be things such as home support, allied health. It doesn't allow for commercial activities that are not directly related to providing services to people that are residing on the land. So the intention is that it remains accommodation for over 55s, and I guess one of the things that it will accommodate is the fact that there may be a retirement village and a residential aged care facility on the same site.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. Councillor Navard?
Yes, universal access. The councillors had requested that universal access should be mentioned as part of the expectation for the facility into the future. Clearly, this is not a feature of the existing facility, and there is a high likelihood that a 3-storey rebuild would actually incorporate such features. But is there an opportunity to actually have this expectation included in the documentation somewhere, please?
Is that Mr. Adams or Ms. Shaw? Ms. Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Yes, it was outlined in the request for proposal documentation. It's actually a requirement of the National Construction Code. So if there was a future development application, that would be a requirement that would need to be adhered to in any instance. There's no requirement under current legislation in that respect to retrospectively apply the standards, but if there's any significant modifications to the existing buildings or new development, it would be required to comply with universal access.
Any further questions, councillors? Councillor Choi.
Yes, thank you. Through the chair, and again to CEO Bradford for his responses before and during this meeting. My next question is, what is the value of the land subject to the major land transaction currently, and what will it be once it is acquired by the city with the land tenure changed to conditional freehold?
Mr Adams, should I send that in your direction?
So currently on our books, the land sits at zero value because it's Crown land, it's not our land. It's just vested in us through a management order. The valuation that's provided by Landgate to the Minister is $38.5 million. Obviously, with the constraints that it's only to be used as a retirement village, that value kind of becomes irrelevant because it is only ever going to be able to be used for accommodation for over 55s and the associated services. So it has a significant constraint on it. But the value, as part of the conditional freehold process, the government seeks from the Valuer General a value of the land. And that valuation provided to us was $38.5 million.
Any further questions? Councillor Choi.
Yes, thank you through the chair again to Director Adams. Now, I did get a response to a question about the book value. I think at June 2022, it was 24 million in relation to the Collier Park Village, and then it was 23 million at June 23. So do I understand that it goes down each year? So we'd be expecting that book value to reduce again this year or stay the same?
Mr Adams.
Normally, you would be correct because we'd be applying depreciation. But the book value will likely remain the same because under the accounting standards, they require that non-current assets that are held for resale, they're measured at the lower of its carrying value amount and fair value, less the cost to sell. So the standard also provides that no depreciation is charged on those assets held for sale. So pretty much the value of 23 million is what the book value would be.
Thank you, Mr Adams. Councillor Choi.
Yes, thank you. Just my final question through the chair, and thanks again to Director Adams. How many exits from Collier Park Village have occurred to date, and what liability value has been calculated for that? And how many more exits are the city aware of or expected to occur prior to transfer of the land and village to the proponents?
Mr Adams.
Predicting exits at the village is not something that we do. Exits are often related to ill health or people passing away. Obviously, you know, if somebody's exiting, they're normally going into high care or, as I said, they've passed away. So there are a few that are the exception to that and moving to other places. The Heads of Agreement currently considers 4 entries that were in progress when this process commenced, and since then there are 4 exits that have occurred. So, you know, I mean, over the next few months, there could be a small number of exits, but you know, we can't really predict that.
Thank you, Mr Adams. Councillors, any further questions on this item? Councillor Brenda Abrandis.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I wouldn't mind just going through some of the numbers that we're actually including in the business plan. So just firstly, with regard to the roof repairs, is that going to be firstly an operating expense, or will it be a qualifying asset and capitalised? That's the first part of that question.
Perhaps I'll let Mr Adams or Mr Lecoq have a go at that one first. Mr Adams?
So we're not doing the roof repairs. The roof repairs are part of the transaction, part of the liability that's been deducted as part of the transaction. So the 1.5 million is obviously an estimate that we agree with of the work, and that be undertaken by Amana upon transaction of the village.
Thank you, Mr Adams. And your second question, Councillor Brenda Brandis?
Thank you, Director Adams. That was my second question, so you've actually answered it. Wonderful. Thank you. The next question I've got is this with regard to the asset values as part of the sale disposal. It's showed here is 24.5 million. I was just wondering, did that include the 1.5 million in the calculation for those roof repairs? Because I could see building values of 23 million, and then it referred to plus the adjustment, and I was assuming that was the 1.5 million for the roof repairs. Is the value meant to be 24.5 million or 23 million?
Mr Adams?
So if you look at paragraph 6.4, page 11 of the business plan, it says at the bottom, this means the city will dispose of assets estimated at $24.5 million, 23 million in fixed assets and 1.5 million in funds as indicated above. That excludes the value of the land. So, yep.
Councillor Brenda Brandis?
Sorry, so just to clarify, that 1.5 million was for the roof repairs, but we're adding that to our asset values on transfer?
Mr Adams?
Yeah, because it's 1.5 million in cash.
Aye, okay, fine, thanks. So based on that asset value and our current leasehold liabilities, we're anticipating at this point it would be a small loss, but subject to any adjustment for leaseholder liability value at completion.
Mr Adams?
Yes.
And do you have a rough indication as to how much that loss would be based on today's values?
Mr Adams or Mr Lecoq? I'd forgive you if you needed to take that on notice.
I think he's got the answer.
I can make an informed guesstimate because there is uncertainties, obviously also pertaining to exits, etc., and other smaller moving parts. But yeah, we would anticipate a ultimate loss in the vicinity of $500,000 to $800,000, potentially $1 million.
Thank you, Mr Lecoq. That's fine, thank you.
Thank you, Mr Lecoq and Mr Adams. Councillors, do we have any further questions for the administration on this item this evening? I'll just ask one question then, and I think it's to Ms Shaw. My question is, has the City Administration spoken with the residents of Collier Park Village? And if so, what do the residents think about the proposal from Amana Living?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Yes, so as outlined in the deputation, Amana Living actually met with the residents along with the city. The feedback we received from those two sessions with the residents were that they were very happy with the prospect of Amana Living taking over the village, which was great. We've since provided separate updates to the residents along the way via their newsletter and via our staff at the village. Depending on the outcome, or regardless of the outcome of Council's decision next Tuesday, we're intending to have a meeting with the residents the following day to provide them a further update on the decision of Council.
Thank you so much. Mr Bradford?
I might add, certainly in my discussions more recently with residents, that they've become very comfortable with Amana generally, because they've actually had a fair bit to do with them as Amana's been doing its due diligence. And I've had observations made to me that in the time that we've been speaking to residents and the time Amana has been doing due diligence, they've become comfortable. And I think the majority of residents now want to make sure nothing gets in the way of the transaction.
Thank you very much. Councillors, Councillor Choi.
Thank you through the chair. Yeah, just one more question following on from that. Just wondering if the city can just confirm the surety for the residents for not just their continuity of accommodation and services at Collier Park Village, but also for the future upgrades to facilities being undertaken as intended by the city through the request for proposal process.
Mr Adams?
So obviously, Amana will be taking this on as a long-term project, a long-term operation. The development will need to happen over a long period of time. But you know, there are certain things we can put into the contract to make sure that you know, there is some surety around that. But ultimately, I guess, you know, the surety lies around the fact that the village will need to be financially viable going into the future, and the only way for it to be financially viable is for capital upgrades to be undertaken, and those capital upgrades we had estimated at between $100 and $200 million. So, you know, it's not something that the city would ever have been able to undertake, but Amana has the capacity and the expertise to do that. So a lot of the surety lies around the fact that Amana's a for-purpose operator in this space, and that they'll do everything that they need to make the village financially viable into the future, and that requires a lot of capital investment.
Thank you, Mr Adams. Councillor Brenda Abrandis?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. It follows on from the previous comments from Director Adams. Just with regard to the $200 million estimate, was that an estimate based on replacing all of the buildings at Collier Park Village, or was that just a portion of the replacement? And was that an independent valuation or just a building estimate?
Mr Adams?
It was an estimate provided by Ansell Strategic right at the beginning of the process. Before we went out to tender, I think we briefed council on you know, what the requirements were to create a contemporary village. So it was on the basis of having to replace the accommodation that is there now, and create the amenity that's required to have contemporary retirement village and associated services on the site.
Thank you, Mr Adams. Any further questions, councillors? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.1.2, RFT 10 of 2023, provision of pump track at George Bennett Park. This report considers submissions received from the advertising of tender 10 of 2023 for the provision of a pump track at George Bennett Park, including the design and delivery of the pump track. The report will outline the assessment process used during the evaluation of tenders received and recommend approval of the tenderer that provides best value for money and level of service to the city. I note there is a confidential attachment for this item.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, Councillor D'Souza, question.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. And given the confidential nature of the attachment, if the city can advise if some questions may stray into that, that would be appreciated. So my first question is it possible for this contract to be broken up into two stages, stage one being design and consult, and then stage two being the actual construction?
Ms Shaw, is that something we can answer without going into confidential territory?
It is. Thank you, Mr Mayor. So the request for tender process has already been undertaken on the basis of it being a design and construct for the pump track. In terms of our requirement to meet the funding ability for the grant funding, we need to deliver the project within a certain timeframe, which is before June 2025. So there's really no ability for us to break it out without potentially losing the grant funding.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor D'Souza?
Thank you, Ms Shaw. And given that's not the case, is it possible to put something in the contract or some other mechanism which allows council to obtain some sort of design briefing prior to this process being done in order for council to reflect community feedback?
Ms Shaw?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. So the submitters were required to put in a concept plan for the pump track, which they've done, and we can make that available to elected members. In terms of the detailed design itself, the intention is that the tenderer will work with the community and we'll work with them on an engagement strategy for them to target the appropriate community groups to basically come up with the detailed final design. The intention would be that once that's finalised, we would present that back to council via the elected member CEO bulletin.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor D'Souza?
I think this question might potentially be confidential. Is that
Do you
correct?
want me to come back when item 15, when we go behind closed doors, so you can ask it then?
Yes. Yes.
All right, that's what we'll do.
I have other questions.
Okay.
So the am I allowed to disclose the works proposed in the tenders in these questions?
Councillor D'Souza, if you're not sure, probably safest to do it behind closed doors, I reckon.
Okay. So further questions. In terms of what consultation activities the proponent plans to undertake, that wasn't made clear in the report. Is it possible to advise on what specific consultation activities they will undertake to ensure the public have their say?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. It wasn't actually provided, and it wasn't specified. Detailed requirements like that weren't specified in the tender that went out. So what the intention is that the city will work with them to prepare a stakeholder engagement plan. We will then call for expressions of interest from local community groups, such as bike riding groups in the South Perth Youth Network. And we'll involve these groups in a community workshop to finalise the detailed design for the track.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor D'Souza?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Now, this strictly isn't a BMX track, but in terms of its accessibility, I presume it can be used by BMX riders as well. So in terms of the broadest possible use for the public, would that be a correct assertion?
Ms Shaw?
Yes, that's correct. There'd be jump line components included in it, which is more appropriate for older young people.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any further questions on this item this evening, at least until we go behind closed doors? Councillor Choi.
Thank you through the chair. So firstly, I'm just wondering what the approximate size of the pump track is. Is that something that we need to wait for detailed design for, or has the city got an estimate?
Ms Shaw?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. Yes, we would need to wait for the detailed design. So we have an indicative location, but we don't know the full extent of the area until we go through the detailed design.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi? Oh, Mr Bradford, sorry.
I was just going to say, given that response, what were you trying to get out of that question?
Thank you through the chair to Director Shaw and CEO Bradford. I'm just wondering, because we haven't actually got the George Burnett Master Plan finalised yet. And so my next question was going to be along those lines of, well, we're sort of, it's great that we've got this funding and no way diminishing that. That's a fantastic achievement by the city to get the external funding that it has for the pump track, and long-awaited pump track it has been, I think since 2021. But I'm just wondering, we're looking at installing new infrastructure at the park before finalising the master plan. So I'm just wondering how large is it going to be in terms of where it's going to be. And also because the original master plan dated 2020, there was actually a map. And I understand that the location of the pump track now is different to where it was meant to be in 2020. So yeah, it's kind of all leads into it. Those questions all sort of lead into each other as to the explanation for you, Mr. CEO.
So, Ms Shaw?
Thank
I'm
you.
assuming that's the question you want to ask, Councillor Choi?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. The master plan itself, you're right, was in 2020. Council further considered the concept of a pump track in August 2021 and again in November 2021. And since that time, there have been various decisions made by Council related to George Burnett Reserve in itself. So things like the shared use path and the use of the former Manning Library as a dome. So all of those factors have been considered in relation to siting the future pump track, as well as site considerations itself. So for example, geotechnical investigations on the site where between the existing skate park and the rear of George Burnett itself, there's no trees in that location, so it's a cleared area of grass that would be suitable without any other disruptions to infrastructure on the site or any of the vegetation on the site.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Bradford? Sorry, Mr Bradford.
So the draft master plan from 2020, the location is still broadly consistent in that the location of a proposed BMX or pump track was considered to be between the skate park and the building, and the more recent decision to move it slightly further west as a consequence of some of the comments that Director Shaw mentioned, trees, the geotech, passive surveillance and those sorts of things, but it's broadly consistent with the 2020 master plan.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Any further questions on this item, councillors? Councillor Sousa.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. And just confirming the entire surface of the pump track is to be asphalt?
Ms Shaw?
Oh, yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Any further questions, councillors?
And,
Councillor Sousa.
Final one for the non-confidential section, Mr Mayor. Is the city satisfied of any safety liability issues of this project and, having the skate component quite close to the pump track and potentially integrating?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you. They're all factors that are considered in the detailed design of the pump track itself, so whether that's compliance with Australian standards and the like. In terms of the actual use, we'd be intending to hold free workshops with the community to kind of teach them how to use the pump track, as well as install appropriate signage, etc. And we also have the appropriate public liability insurance.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any final questions on this item? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.1.3, RFT 11 of 2023, provision of lift maintenance services. This report considers submissions received from the advertising of tender 11 of 2023 for the provision of lift maintenance services. This report will outline the assessment process used during the evaluation of tenders received and recommends approval of the tenderer that provides the best value for money and level of service to the city.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, any questions on this item? Councillor Brenda Abrandis.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. It'll be a confidential question, so we could ask later on behind closed doors.
I'll make a note to return to this item when we're behind closed doors. Thank you for the heads up.
Thank you, sir.
Any open questions on this item, councillors? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.1.4, RFT 13 of 2023, Coma Public Toilet Upgrade. This report considers submissions received from the advertising of tender 13 of 2023 for the Coma Public Toilet Upgrade. The report outlines the assessment process used for the evaluation of tenders received and recommends approval of the tenderer that provides the best value for money and level of service to the city.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, any questions on this item? Councillor Navard.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. My questions were, does this facility include a change facility? That was one. I was not clear from the plan, so my question related to whether in that space there was also, wasn't there a change facility or was it simply toilets? So that was my first question.
Ms Amprema.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. There's no dedicated change facility, however there is a universal access toilet which if someone needed to change they could utilise that part of the facility.
Okay, thank you. And I also asked about the assumed funds not being repurposed from RAF funding, presumably because of the time frame that wouldn't have been likely, but I did want to ask the city whether that was correct, whether it was a redirection of RAF funds.
Ms Amprema.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. There's no connection between this project and the federal grant funding that was received for the RAF project.
Thank you. And my other question was that did the facility include ambulant or a disability facility in the toilet?
Ms Amprema.
Yep, thank you, Mr Mayor. the current standard is to provide a universal access toilet, which is included in the proposal.
Thank you, Ms Ambremo. Councillors, any further questions on this item? Councillor Choi.
Yes, thanks, Mr Mayor. I've just got one. I'm just wondering, in looking at the budget and the financial implications noted on page 20 of the agenda, how does the budget for a toilet upgrade increase from around 250,000 to 450,000 in under a year, please? Just trying to wrap my head around that.
Should I send that to Ms Ambremo? Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the question. The market that we are currently operating in, and I need to try and couch my answer appropriately given that we're not in confidential session, but the market that we're operating in is significantly volatile, and the prices that we receive for tenders of this nature vary greatly. So predicting what budget we require is pretty challenging because the prices coming back from the market from one project to another do vary so significantly.
Thank you, Ms Ambremo. Any further questions, councillors? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.1.5, RFT 1 of 2024, provision of graffiti removal and high pressure cleaning. This report considers submissions received from the advertising of tender 1 of 2024 for the provision of graffiti removal and high pressure cleaning. The report outlines the assessment process used during the evaluation of tenders received and recommends approval of the tender that provides the best value for money and level of service to the city.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, any queries on this item? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.3.1, proposed outbuilding lot 100, number 20 Clydesdale Street, Neil McDougall Park, Como. The purpose of this report is to consider an application for development approval for an outbuilding at Neil McDougall Park to be leased to the South Perth Society of Arts and Crafts. This item is referred to Council as Neil McDougall Park as a Category B heritage listed place, and the proposal is for works by a private entity on city-owned land and therefore falls outside the delegation to officers. Should Council resolve to approve the development application, the existing lease will be required to be amended to include the portion of the reserve where the outbuilding is proposed to be located. For the reasons outlined in the report, it is recommended that the application be approved and the lease be amended.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, any questions on this item? Councillor Choi.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I've just got one. I understand the applicant will own the shed on city land. Is that right?
Ms Shaw, should I send that in your direction? Or Ms Mullen?
Thank you, through the chair. That's correct. The society is paying for the shed, so they will own the actual shed being constructed.
Councillor Choi.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor, through the chair to Ms Mullen. So if that's the case, what will happen to the shed when they are no longer the lessee?
Ms Mullen.
Thank you, through the chair. I'd have to take that question on notice because I think it strays into a governance area.
Thank you, Ms Mullen. Any further questions, councillors?
We can answer.
Yes, Mr Adams.
Normally, with leases where we're letting somebody put something on our land that doesn't end up being a permanent fixture, there is a clause that they remove and make good at the end of the lease.
Thank you, Mr Adams. Councillors, any further questions on this item? Councillor Navard.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Would there be any need for a cooperative relationship to exist between the South Perth Society for Arts and Crafts and their next door neighbours, which is the new Community Garden Project Managers, Aquinas College?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. No, there'd be no formal requirement. So the outbuilding is located to the southeast of the existing house, whereas the community garden's to the north. The proposal's to effectively store bookbinding equipment, so there's really no further relationship that needs to occur in that respect.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Any further questions, councillors? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.3.2, Design Review Panel Appointment of Panel Members. The purpose of this report is for Council to consider appointing members to the City of South Perth Design Review Panel for a 2-year period.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, any questions on this item? Councillor Navard.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. What is the intention in outsourcing of the South Perth review panel potentially to other LGAs who do not have a design panel?
Thank you. Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So from time to time, the city receives requests, predominantly from regional local governments who don't have their own design review panel, to actually use the city's design review panel. And the reason being is that our existing panel and its members is held up as a really great example of a successful design review panel. It operates quite well and the advice provided is quite sound. So the intent of including that in the body of the report is to effectively formalise that arrangement. So then it's clear for any other local governments who are seeking to use our design review panel what the process is that they need to follow. And that would effectively be that they would make a request in writing to use the panel and provide details of the application to be considered. They would then need to pay the prescribed fee for the use of the panel itself. And in addition to that, we would be proposing an administrative fee for the city to actually undertake those inquiries and to provide the matters on the agenda itself. And so that would be something for council to consider as part of the fees and charges when considering the budget.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Navard.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. What fees are currently in place for the members and the chair of our current panel? And could the skill set of the membership be revisited to also include knowledgeable plantings design, especially for resilient foliage cover in a changing climate? And would fees set for this group impact fees provided for other city-paid committee members?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So there's no prescribed fee for the remuneration of the current members on the DRP. They're paid between $200 and $300 based on their experience level. In terms of plantings and the like, the expression of interest for members included expertise in sustainability and landscape architecture, and they would typically provide comments related to waterwise plantings, landscape-related matters. They do so in accordance with State Planning Policy number 7, which is Design of the Built Environment. Within that document, there are 10 design principles that the DRP is considering applications against, and one of them is landscape quality. So they're factoring in matters such as existing vegetation on site, how it can be retained, improved landscape plans when they're submitted as part of the application, and just various features related to tree retention and landscape architecture. And then in terms of payment for the members in terms of committees, they're not a formal committee of council in accordance with section 5.8 of the Local Government Act. So council would need to consider adopting fees and charges and the remuneration fee as part of setting the budget for payment of the members.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Very comprehensive. Another question, Councillor Navard.
Yes, please, Mr Mayor. Why does the number of members need to be expanded, and is there a risk to the city if members also sit on other design panels, for example, Development WA, that may impact the city decisions?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So the panel itself stays at 4. In terms of the pool of members that we pull from, when we went out for the expression of interest, I don't think we were expecting to receive the extent of high quality applicants that we did. And given some of the candidates have areas of expertise beyond what the existing panel members provide, such as heritage, we were seeking to expand the pool, and then based on the nature and type of the application, that would determine which panel members from the pool we call up for the actual 4-member panel to consider the application itself.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any further questions on this item? Councillor Choi.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. I've just got a couple of questions. Just first of all, following on from Councillor Navard's questions, how does that scrutiny over landscape quality and environmental features actually work in practice on the panel? And can there be any future stringent guidelines implemented to take into regards some of the intent in Councillor Prendeville's motion this evening on urban forest policy and advisory group, in particular that advisory group or committee that's being sought? Is there anything that can be...
Hold on, Councillor Choi. Standing orders do require questions to be short and succinct. Maybe if you can ask the questions one at a time, that would give Director Shaw a better chance of answering them.
Yeah, sorry, that was the end of my question. Basically, it's just, is there anything further that can be done on that DRP in terms of panel members or guidelines to take into account some of the intent around the environmental features and quality landscape design?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Apologies, Councillor Navard, I didn't answer the second part of your question. The DRP members themselves, they're not a decision-making body. And so even though the agenda itself has a section for declaration of interest, and when we receive the applications and are calling upon the members to form the 4-member panel, we check with them whether or not they have a conflict of interest and try and choose the panel appropriately. There's actually no conflict in the sense that they're not actually making a decision, they're only providing advice. In respect to the notice of motion and the trees, I think the only section where it would relate in relation to the DRP is the review of development applications themselves. And so, as I mentioned in response to Councillor Navard, part of the role of the DRP is to consider against the 10 design principles. As I mentioned, one of them is landscape quality. Another one of the principles is sustainability. So there are specific measures within the description of those 10 principles around ensuring sustainable design and, where possible, retaining existing vegetation on the site. In terms of their ability to do that, I think we've had quite good outcomes, to be honest. In a lot of the time, given design review panel occurs before a development application is lodged, we often have applicants redesign proposals to retain trees on the site. Or they'll go through multiple iterations of design review, and the panels won't give them a green score to move on to the next stage unless they redesign the proposal to meet the comments of the design review panel. So it has been effective in that respect, but similar to any development application and decision-making body, the state legislation obviously covers matters related to trees in that respect.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any further questions on this item this evening? Councillor Choi.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So my next question, I'm not sure it can be answered now, maybe it has to be answered when we go behind closed doors later on. But I guess I'll start with, is the city able to advise, firstly, the types of members the DRP is to comprise under this proposed appointment?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So no, that was public because it was part of the expression of interest for the membership. So it's effectively architects, urban designers, heritage specialists, transport planners, sustainability and environmental design consultants. I think that's generally it, or anyone with structural engineering and public art expertise as well. But typically design review panels, we typically receive expressions from architects and urban designers predominantly because the majority of comments that they're providing on is on the built form itself.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi, another question?
Yes, thank you, through the Chair to Director Shaw. So following on from that question, is the city satisfied that it's, has got a good cross-section and covered the field in terms of those disciplines that Director Shaw has just mentioned?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Yes, we are. And if Council proceeds with the officer recommendation, I think we'll have a greater level of expertise than what's currently provided in the pool, given some of the backgrounds we've received nominations from.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any further questions? Councillor Choi.
Thank you, through the Chair, again to Director Shaw. If the DRP members' fees are to be undertaken as part of the 24-25 annual budget preparation, are the proposed applicants accepting a nomination based on an undisclosed, undetermined and potentially lower fee than expected or being currently received? And what are the implications, if any, of this, please?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, that's correct. The expression of interest didn't include the remuneration fee because there's no fee prescribed by council in its adopted budget. But typically what happens with design review panels is the members themselves are employed elsewhere. They're typically architects working on different jobs and the like, and they're doing it more to give back to the sector. So they give up a few hours of their time to sit on various design review panels, but they're otherwise employed. So I don't think the remuneration is a sticking point for them in whether they put their hand up for the DRP. And for that reason, I don't think there's any reason that we would need to wait until we set fees in the adopted fees and charges before appointing people to the panel. And if anything, I would recommend that you proceed with appointing members to make sure we retain the candidates that have nominated.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Any further questions, councillors? All right, and just a gentle reminder to all councillors, to the extent that questions have already been asked of the administration and answered, and the answers have been provided to all of the councillors already, do consider whether it's necessary to ask that same question again in the chamber. So with that, next item please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.4.1, listing of payments February 2024. This report presents to council a list of accounts paid under delegated authority between 1 and 29 February 2024 for information. It also includes purchase card transactions between 1 January and 31 January 2024 in line with the new legislative requirements.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, any questions on this item? Councillor Choi.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just looking at the Coode Street change rooms expenditure, I'm just wondering, are those change rooms disability compliant?
Mr Adams, should I send that in your direction? Ms Amprimo.
So the question around whether they would be disability access change rooms came up when we had the budget workshops at the beginning of the year, and the beginning of the end of the previous financial year for this current year's budget. And what the city discussed with the elected members at that time was that we would seek to see how these change rooms went and then look to put in a disability access one where the disability access beach wheelchair is located further along South Perth foreshore. So this wasn't intended to be change rooms for people with special needs access.
Thank you, Ms Amprimo. Councillors, Councillor Choi.
Thank you through the chair to Director Amprimo. I'm just wondering in terms of HR contract costs and other contract and material costs, it appears to be that they have increased, and I'm just wondering, is there more expenditure now on contract staff over employed staff, or is there any sort of explanation around that?
Have you got a specific question, or is it just a general question?
Is the city spending more money now on contract staff than it does on employed staff?
Compared to when, or just generally?
Well, say within this financial year.
So you're asking whether or not this financial year so far, which hasn't actually concluded yet, you're asking whether or not we've spent more money on contract staff or on employed staff. Is that your question?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. Is there a general trend?
Mr Adams?
So we only use, and by contract staff, I'm assuming you mean, given that we're talking about the listing of payments, the payments to the staffing agencies, so not staff that are just on contract, but staff through agencies. We only tend to use staff through agencies when we've exhausted our other options, or it's a really short-term appointment and we need specialist skills. I'm not aware that we are spending any more than we have in previous years, although we have been struggling to fill some of our vacancies through normal recruitment processes. But having said that, there's been times when we've also gone to an agency and they haven't been able to fill that vacancy for us either because of the type of skills that we need and the shortage in the market. So I'm not aware that we're actually spending any more than we have in previous years.
Thank you, Mr Adams. Councillors, any further questions on this item? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.4.2, monthly financial statements, February 2024. The monthly financial statements are provided within attachments A through I, with a high level of analysis contained in the comments of the report.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, any questions on this item? Councillor Choi.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'm just following the deputation earlier this evening and foreshadowing a potential motion in relation to the electors' motion 6 on page 47 of the agenda. Is there any reason why the elected member honour boards cannot be either displayed in the council's lounge or in a suitable public place, together with the mayoral portraits, which are individual artworks that are, as has been said, rarely seen by the public? Or is the city able to consider taking up the suggestion that perhaps there is an annual event?
Sorry, I might just interrupt there, Councillor Choi. I thought we were at 10.4.2. Did I miss one?
I've jumped forward. Sorry about that.
All right. Okay, so councillors, any questions relating to item 10.4.2, monthly financial statements for February 2024? No. Okay. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.4.3, the Electors' General Meeting 22-23. This report allows council to consider the outcome of the Electors' General Meeting held on Tuesday the 6th of February 2024.
Councillor Choi, I assume you wanted to ask a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor, and sorry about that before. Do I need to repeat it, or is the city happy to answer?
It's about the honour boards, is it? Okay, so Mr Gleeson has left, but I meet regularly with Mr Gleeson and discuss honour boards and other things with him. We actually went and had a look at the honour boards. The honour boards are actually not old honour boards in the sense of, you know, the grand old Jarrah boards that you might see in an RSL or something like that. These are Perspex boards that I think were created, I reckon, around the 90s. They're actually very hard to read and they've been in storage in the bowels of the city, so I don't know what else to describe, in the basement of the city. We don't have a suitable place to display them. They are available on the city's website to view. Have you anything to add, Director Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Yeah, only in terms of the artwork as well, in the mural portraits. So I've had a chat about that with our Cultural Development Officer and whether there's any appropriate locations for them to be displayed, given the number of them and the size, etc. There's none at the moment, however, they are publicly available because all of our artworks are actually provided on the city's website. You can scroll through and have a look at the individual paintings.
I mean, one of the considerations is a site that's got reasonable security, because if it's going to be open to the public, it needs to be reasonably secure, and that's why we don't really have anywhere that's really suitable and that's open to the public, because it's not staffed or manned. I mean, certainly, somewhere like the South Perth Historical Society could be a potential site for some of those, particularly the portraits are out the back, potentially, but they might have a say about that.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillor Cavaney?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. What makes the Councillors' Lounge an inappropriate place for the honour boards?
Who should I direct that to? Councillor, Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Sorry. In terms of whether they're appropriate, the city doesn't believe they're inappropriate. It's just they're not publicly accessible.
Right. Okay. The Council's Lounge is not a publicly open room.
Any further questions on this item, councillors? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor.
We've done the Electors' General Meeting. We're up to 10.4.4.
Item 10.4.4, RF2 2 of 2024, provision of catering services. This report considers submissions received from the advertising of tender 2 of 2024 for the provision of catering services. The report outlines the assessment process used for the evaluation of tenders received and recommends approval of the tender that provides the best value for money and level of service to the city.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, remember that there's a confidential attachment to this item. Are there any questions on this item? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.4.5, meeting fees for independent committee members. This report seeks council's approval for independent committee members to receive meeting fees in accordance with the Local Government Chief Executive Officer's and elected members' determination, number 1 of 2023.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, any questions on this item? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.5.1, quarterly activity report. This report outlines the activities undertaken by the City of South Perth relating to risk management, business continuity and workplace health and safety in the third quarter of the 23-24 financial year, and an overview of the activities planned for the fourth quarter.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, do remember there's a confidential attachment to this, well, 2 confidential attachments to this item. Any questions on this item? Councillor Navard.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. In fact, I put a question to Mr Adams because I just thought it would be helpful if I read it out. Now, Mr Adams explained that it would be best if that would come through to the ordinary council meeting in terms of the answer, but I thought it's good to just alert people to the questions. I had 4 aspects to risk relating to staff. So it was, would it be possible at this to provide the following: percentage staff turnover, half yearly starting from July 1. So that was one question. The next one was the number of permanent...
Perhaps we'll do this one at a time, Councillor Navard. It's easier for people to remember if they can answer the questions one by one instead of getting several questions at once. Mr Adams?
I did advise Councillor Navard that I had some of the information at hand, but other information that she may want would take some time and effort to get, but we can have it for the next, for the council meeting. But that one in particular, so as at the end of February, our turnover rate was 24.11%.
Thank you, Mr Adams. Your next question, Councillor Navard.
Thank you. The number of permanent and contract staff appointed in the 6 months starting from July 1, 2023.
Thank you. Mr Adams.
Yeah, I have to take that one on notice.
Councillor Navard.
And the next one, the number of these permanent and contract staff who have been retained as of the end of February 2024.
Mr Adams.
And that one.
And Councillor Navard.
And the last one is the number of positions that remain vacant as of the end of February 2024.
Mr Adams.
And again, I'll take that one on notice.
Thank you. Councillor Navard, I do have an obligation to keep the questions relevant. I do know that item 10.5.1 basically is calling upon council to just note 3 things and endorse a strategic risk register. Just so we're all aware,
It's to do with risk. That was why I was asking the questions.
All right, thank you. Any other questions on this item, councillors? No? Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.5.2, Council Policy P210, Street Verges. This report recommends amendments to Council Policy P210, Street Verges, to restrict the use of the verge for constructed residential and visitor car parking bays associated with development applications.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, any questions on this item? Councillor Choi.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. My first question is just in relation to the type of policy. So policy P210 is not a local planning policy. It doesn't appear to refer to any planning instruments. So I'm just wondering why that this planning provision would appear here in this policy as compared to a planning policy, please.
Ms Shaw, should I send that your way?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. So it's a council policy created under the Local Government Act instead of a local planning policy created under the planning regulations. In terms of the matters that are contained within council policies, the Local Government Act doesn't prescribe which matters it needs to consider. So it is open for a council policy to include matters related to planning. However, when we assess a development application, we would take into consideration a local planning policy because council policies aren't prescribed under clause 67 of our regulations, being matters that are otherwise considered in the assessment of an application. Notwithstanding, the verge itself obviously has an impact because you need to have a crossover to get to the actual site, or there may be times, such as provided in this report, where the developer may seek to use a portion of the reserve or the verge area. So that's a separate approval process from the city. So if there was a provision contained within the council policy that said you couldn't use the verge area for car parking, when we receive the development application, we would advise applicants that there's a separate council policy that says the verge is not to be used for that purpose and that they would be unlikely to obtain approval from the city to construct bays within the verge, which then may otherwise influence the design of their proposal on the actual site.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any further questions on this item? Councillor Choi?
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and through the Chair to Director Shaw. So I understand that policy P210 doesn't carry the same weight as local planning policy then under the regulations as it's a council policy, is that correct?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. No, not in the sense of determining a development application, but it carries weight in the sense that when we're considering applications for use of the verge itself and the separate approvals process provided to enable use of the road reserve.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi, I do notice that these questions have already been answered by Ms Shaw and the answers have been circulated to all the councillors. Is it necessary to keep asking the rest of these questions?
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you again to Director Shaw, who has added a bit more detail to that last question, which is why I did ask it. And I do present the questions on notice out of courtesy to the officers so they actually are able to provide the answer at the meeting and not have to take them on notice for the next meeting. So yeah, I would prefer to, there's only 2 more questions if I could please read them out.
Just a gentle reminder that not all questions need to be asked at the council agenda briefing, but please proceed.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. What are the implications, if any, of the proposed provision being broadened to apply district-wide and not just to the Canning Bridge Activity Centre?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So there are 2 reasons that we included the Canning Bridge Activity Centre plan area. The first being that was the basis of the original notice of motion itself. There were concerns about ongoing use of the verge in that area for car parking bays. And the second reason is that all of the development applications that are considered in the Canning Bridge Activity Centre plan area, that activity centre plan explicitly prescribes that applications need to be considered against volume 2 of the residential design codes, which is the apartments, regardless of the type of application it is. So even if an application for a single house came in within that area that would otherwise be assessed against volume 1 of the R codes, it's still assessed against volume 2. Volume 1 of the R codes provides the ability for a design principle assessment, which effectively means that where the deemed to comply requirement hasn't been met, which is otherwise providing the bays on the development site, there is the option for the decision maker to consider use of the verge for car parking bays. The majority of the rest of the city is low density in terms of residential development and would be assessed against volume 1 of the R codes. And for that reason, given it's prescribed in state policy that they have the option to consider using the verge, we've only recommended that the addition be to the Canning Bridge Activity Centre plan area.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi?
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and through the Chair to Director Shaw, and that I won't ask the last question, that's fine, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Choi. Councillors, any other questions on this item? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.5.3, Council Policy P402, alfresco dining. This report recommends amendments to Council Policy P402, alfresco dining to provide detailed requirements for the use and management of alfresco dining, as well as inclusion of criteria for parklets.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, any questions on this item? Councillor Choi.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'm just wondering, given the comments made on page 73 of the agenda about the fees, why can't this policy wait until after the fees have been determined at the through the budget workshops at the end of June or early July?
Ms Shaw, should I send that your way?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. It could wait for that. When council previously considered the Parklet application, it actually resolved to waive the fees for that. Our preference is to at least have a policy in place that prescribes design criteria if any applications are received. We're not too far from setting the budget. So I don't see them as necessarily related in that respect. We already do have alfresco dining fees and charges. We just don't have a fee for Parklet proposals. We don't receive them that often. We've only received one in the history of the city.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Chua?
Thank you through the Chair to Director Shaw. So just confirming, sorry, you've only received the one Parklet application, that is for the one that's already been approved. There's been no other further applications received since then?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, that's correct.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any further questions on this item? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.5.4, Delegation DC 690, Town Planning Scheme 6. This report presents new delegations in response to state government planning reform and to support implementation of Local Planning Scheme number 7, which was granted final approval by the Minister for Planning. It also presents a proposed new delegation for matters pertaining to illegal development under the Planning and Development Act 2005.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, any questions on this item? Councillor Choi?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. I've got a few questions. First one is, in foreshadowing an amended motion to item 10.5.4 in respect to delegation DC 690, and in noting that delegation DC 692 was not actually listed in the agenda contents against the item, can the City separate out Council delegation DC 690 from delegation DC 692 and list them separately for the ordinary council meeting, please, so that council may debate and vote on these delegations individually? I believe we've done that before.
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So we could still consider them regardless, because part 2 of the officer recommendation deals with the proposed delegation for enforcement and legal proceedings. If there were any changes proposed to the proposed delegations for Local Planning Scheme number 7, there could be an amendment to part 1B of the officer recommendation prescribing what amendments are proposed to be made. And then if that recommendation is carried, then there would be the changes to the delegations themselves, as well as adoption of the new delegation for the enforcement and illegal proceedings.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Any further questions, councillors? Councillor Choi?
Thank you through the Chair again to Director Shaw. Pursuant to paragraph 1B of the proposed amended Schedule 1 Conditions of Delegation DC 690, in changing the term high level to new residential aged care facilities, does that mean any development applications received by the City in relation to existing residential aged care facilities would no longer come to Council, including for Collier Park Village?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So the intent of changing that delegation was really to distinguish between residential aged care facilities and high care facilities, because the way the existing delegation itself reads almost as if only high care facilities would be considered by council. So the result of that change is that any new facilities for both high care or residential aged care would need to come to council for a decision. In respect to any future redevelopment of Collier Park Village, so at the moment the delegation doesn't apply to Collier Park Village because it's Crown land, so it would be determined by the West Australian Planning Commission. In terms of any future development application, it really depends on the value of the works themselves, because the likelihood of a full-scale redevelopment of that site, the estimated cost would likely be beyond $10 million, and it would then therefore be a mandatory joint development assessment panel application, which the City or Council wouldn't consider other than being the representatives on the DAP.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Any further questions, councillors? Councillor Choi?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Again, through the Chair to Director Shaw. I'll just skip a couple of these questions. Pursuant to current paragraph 4 of Delegation DC 690, can the City confirm how it currently manages any changes to conditions of development approvals as endorsed by Council, i.e. are they determined under delegation as they are excluded from the delegation conditions, or do they usually come back to Council for further decision?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So any proposed change to a condition would be an application to amend the development application. So that would require to be brought back to council for a further decision under the current delegation.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Any further questions, councillors? Councillor Choi.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'm just quickly going through this list. So in a situation where a development application is refused under delegation, the applicant objects and appeals to the State Administrative Tribunal. The matter then goes to mediation and an agreement is reached between the City and applicant. What will happen then under this proposed delegation, these changes? Will it come back to the council, or will the City just approve those changes internally, whatever's decided through mediation?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So it depends on the land use itself. And what's prescribed in the delegations that are adopted by council. So, for example, at the moment, the City has delegation to refuse applications for childcare centres, but we don't have the ability to approve applications for childcare centres. So, for example, if we refused a childcare centre and the applicant made an application for review to the State Administrative Tribunal, if SAT then requested that we reconsider the decision for refusal and we were considering approving the application, we would then need to take that application to council to be considered for approval. If we were instead looking to double down and refuse the application again, we could do that under delegation, under the current delegations. So it really depends on the land use itself and the conditions prescribed in the delegations.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, through the Chair again to Director Shaw. The State's Development Assessment Panel publishes publicly the applications it receives and its decisions made on those applications with reasons, with public submissions and deputations also heard. And so what are the implications with the City undertaking similar development application reviews and making decisions internally now, as proposed, against the community's expectations of increased transparency and accountability in respect to developments?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So I think it's a slightly different context, and we had a look at some figures. So the DAP, for example, in 2020-21, all of the DAPs, so the outer and inner and regional DAP, the total number of decisions they had was 287. In that same year alone, just the City of South Perth determined 449 applications. So the administration around considering the volume of applications is quite different to the panel. Regardless though, the City is in the process of building an online register which will show all of our decisions, the timeliness of those decisions and what the decision actually was, and that will enable the public to have oversight of the decisions that the City is actually making. And just in respect to the comparison between the state government, I would encourage you to have a look at the agendas and minutes of the West Australian Planning Commission to see how many items are actually confidential on their agendas.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. My last question, and again to Director Shaw. Proposed Local Government Reform 3.3, which stresses the importance of open and transparent decision making, specified that certain matters, including town planning and development applications, must be held in full public view, with only non-property type related matters to be held confidentially. Can the City outline how its proposed delegation D?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So I think there's a few examples. The first is when council actually adopts the delegations, and that sets the public expectation as to what type of application would be considered by council and what type of application is otherwise determined under delegation. All development applications and associated correspondence are subject to the Freedom of Information Act, so anybody can make that request and review documentation associated with the applications. Where we have an application that requires advertising, we do so in accordance with council's adopted policy, so the members of the public can see copies of the applications and associated plans. The very nature of quasi-judicial decision-making is such that it's required to be open and transparent for natural justice. And then, as I said before, we're in the process of building a register anyway, just to provide that extra layer of oversight for the community in terms of decision-making made under delegation.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any further questions on this item? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.5.5, Audit Register Progress Report, Second Quarter Update. This report provides an update on the progress of actions included in the Audit Register. The Audit Register includes all open audit findings that have previously been accepted by the Audit Risk and Governance Committee and Council. I note there's a confidential attachment to this item as well.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, do we have any questions on this item this evening? No? Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.5.6, Internal Audit Report, 2023 Compliance Audit Return. Pardon me. This report tables the Internal Audit Report, 2023 Compliance Audit Return in accordance with the City's Strategic Internal Audit Plan, 22-23 to 26-27. The report identified the process followed by the City in compiling the 2023 Compliance Audit Return was appropriate and in line with the requirements set by regulations, and therefore no audit findings were identified.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, any questions on this item? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.5.7, Compliance Audit Return. This report provides the City's response to the Department of Local Government, Sport and Cultural Industries 2023 Compliance Audit Return.
Any questions on this item, councillors? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.5.8, Internal Audit Report, Procurement and Contract Management. This report tables the Internal Audit Report, Procurement and Contract Management in accordance with the City's Strategic Internal Audit Plan 22-23 to 26-27. The report contains 3 detailed audit findings with a number of notations and observations. The audit includes strengths, weaknesses, ratings, issues, risk ratings, recommendations and management comments.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, do we have any questions for the administration on this item this evening? No? And that concludes all of the items in item 10. That brings us to item 12, which is motions of which previous notice has been given. The first one is item 12.1, a notice of motion from Councillor Bronwyn Ward entitled Advertising of Short-Term Accommodation Local Planning Policy. Councillors, do we have any questions for the administration on this item? Councillor Coveney.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. What's the cost of the public notice?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'd have to get you the actual details, but the cost is passed on to the applicant. They have to actually pay for the cost of installing the sign on site for a complex development application, so there'd be no cost to the City in that respect. In terms of the internal advertising, it would be officer time in arranging the mail merge and the website updates and the like.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any questions on this item? Councillor Waugh.
Just one. Can you tell me how many STRA uses are there currently within the district of the City of South Perth?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So there's currently one approved short-term rental accommodation, which was approved by Council at the 31st of October meeting last year.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any further questions on this item? Councillor Choi.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. Would the City's own local planning policy, for which Council hasn't had the benefit of receiving and reviewing yet, be much different to the proposed local planning policy put forward by Councillor Waugh? And if so, in what ways, please, other than what's already been outlined in the report?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So we had started drafting one, but yes, we haven't finalised one. So in terms of relevant considerations in comparing it to Councillor Waugh's policy, we would have it apply to unhosted short-term accommodation only. Which is where the development applications have been received to date and won't otherwise be exempt if they're less than 90 days. We hadn't originally intended to include locational criteria, and the reason we didn't want to include that is because we wanted to consider applications on their individual merits regardless of what suburb they were in within the local government area. But if we were to consider that further and would need to see what outcomes come out of the regulations in that respect, we would do some develop some criteria around what would be appropriate for that, and then test the provisions of the policy to see the extent of impact it would actually have. In terms of the guests and management practices, we would probably review that a little bit further and have a look at what we could include, so things like prescribing guests and the like. And you would have seen from the 30 local planning policies that have come before council in the last 12 months, our formatting is obviously slightly different, so we would probably drop it into a different format to make sure the numbering, etc., is consistent with the policies that have already been adopted by council.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any further questions on this item? Councillor Choi.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'm just wondering why the proposed local planning policy has got a high risk rating, noted at page 115 of the council agenda.
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So the policy itself is a low risk because the local planning policy, if council resolves to adopt it for the purposes of advertising, we would follow the usual processes prescribed in the regulations to undertake advertising of the policy. So from a legislative perspective, it is low risk. The reason that I'd included high risk is to do with the reputational risk associated with the proposal, and the details of what's considered reputational risk are included in the description within the report. It predominantly relates to reputational risk of officers, as well as any reports in the media and the like associated with the policy.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, Councillor Cridland.
I haven't read the short-term rental accommodation bill. Sounds outstandingly interesting. Is it likely to, when passed, is it likely to have any impact, I know what's in the report, but on the number of applications for development approval in the city for short-term residential accommodation? Or is it likely to have its commencement delayed pending preparation of the regulations?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So the state government has advised that the registration scheme itself is expected to be up and running mid-year, and that's through DEMIRS. Whereas the changes to the planning regulations will be Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage. So they don't necessarily rely on one another because the registration scheme is intended to be set up. The changes to the planning regulations is what would likely impact provisions contained within a policy compared to the registration scheme itself. In terms of the number of development applications likely to be received, what typically happens is that there are applications listed on platforms at the moment that don't have approval, and we act on a compliance basis. So for example, we've received one complaint this year so far about short-term accommodation. We'll then liaise with the landowners to ask them to lodge a development application. If they don't lodge it, well, they obviously need to cease operating. If it's approved, they can continue operating in accordance with any conditions imposed on that approval. So in terms of the actual number, it may have an impact on applications coming in because the landowners won't be able to list their short stay on platform providers such as Stays and Airbnb unless they actually have the registration number itself. And so the state government has worked with the providers to set that registration scheme up. The only way they can obtain the registration number is if they receive development approval for the use itself. However, with the changes at state government level, any short stay accommodation operating for less than 90 days within a calendar year would be exempt from requiring development approval anyway. So it's only those applications that are looking to operate more than 90 days in the year that would otherwise need to obtain development approval to get their registration number so they can list on these websites.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any further questions on this item? Councillor Choi.
Yes, thanks, Mr Mayor. What are the implications, or are there any other implications other than already outlined or mentioned in the report or as discussed this evening for council in considering whether to endorse this proposed local planning policy, please?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. There are, but they're not directly related to the local planning policy itself. So for example, when we typically prepare policies, we would go through an internal review of local planning policies to test the different provisions to see if there's any unintended consequences related to separate legislation or the impact that it has on the ground effectively, to see if the provisions can operate, which hasn't happened in this instance because obviously the city's hasn't prepared the policy. One of the unintended consequences, I think, is probably on staff morale, to be honest, because we have strategic planners who are obviously employed to prepare these policies, and I personally think they've done a great job. As I said, in the last 12 months, they've reviewed and presented 30 local planning policies, which is a very high amount for any local government. You know, I think they take great satisfaction in being able to prepare the local planning policies and then present them to council for their consideration. And I don't mean this as any disrespect to Councillor Ward, but urban planning is obviously a qualified profession, so they're technical experts preparing the policies, and we consider a range of matters probably on what might not be apparent, I suppose, on the ground for any policies, not necessarily this one. It depends on the nature of the policy and the topic itself. And I suppose probably the last one is more related to the Act and the Code of Conduct for elected members. And there's a prohibition, obviously, against elected members being involved in administrative matters. And whilst the consideration and adoption of local planning policies is a council function, the preparation of local planning policies has traditionally been an administrative matter. So the admin will prepare it and then council will consider the policy. So there's that separation in that respect. So there are probably a few matters that are unrelated to, you know, going forward with the local planning policy and the content itself. They're more just behind the scenes type matters related to the policy.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi.
Thank you, through the chair to Director Shaw. And just following on from that response, if council does not endorse this proposed policy, is there any way when the city drafts its own policy, which I understand it's already started doing, can provisions that maybe aren't included in there, haven't covered the field, could they from this policy be added into that policy potentially as amendments?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Ms Mayor. So it really depends on the timing of when the regulations are actually released themselves, because that's the reason that the city has held off presenting a local planning policy. So we're certainly in agreement that the existing short stay accommodation policy needs to be reviewed. It's just we wanted to wait until we know the outcome of the regulations before we drafted provisions to be included. In terms of modifying it post-advertising, it really depends on the extent of changes. And so what, for example, if we were to look at locational criteria, for the reasons outlined in the report, we wouldn't necessarily include the criteria or some of the terminology contained within the draft policy itself. If the extent of the changes is significant enough, it would be appropriate for council to re-advertise the local planning policy. Whereas if the changes were only minor, then it may be the case that council doesn't need to re-advertise the policy and it can adopt what's provided. So the two determining factors are really what the outcome of the regulatory changes are and a comparison between what the city would have otherwise drafted.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any other questions on this item? I'll ask one. Ms Shaw, the report says that the changes to the regulations are expected to take effect in June of this year. Is there any urgency here? Specifically, is the city likely to suffer any detriment if council were to follow the officer recommendation to wait until the state government's amendments to the planning and development local planning schemes regulations have been finalised?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. The changes to the regulations, the latest advice that we've received from the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage is that we would probably have them in the next month. So we would have a better idea. They wouldn't be finalised, but we would have a better idea about what the extent of changes to the regulations actually are. But in any instance, we're expecting them, based on the state government's timeline, to be finalised by mid-year. So given the fact that we've only received one short stay application. I don't think there's any urgent rush to consider a policy framework. And I think I mentioned in the report originally that regardless of whether we had a policy in place, whether that be this one or the existing short stay accommodation policy, we can always fall back on Clause 67 of the regulations and assess applications in accordance with all of the requirements in that list, which is matters relating to amenity, car parking, traffic, safety, etc. So we're covered in the absence of a local planning policy specifically for short-term rental accommodation.
Thank you so much. Any further questions, councillors? No. Okay. That brings us to item 12.2. It's a notice of motion from Councillor Hayley Prendeville entitled Tree Protection and Urban Forest Advisory Group. Councillors, do we have any questions for the administration on this item? Councillor Coveney.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So to confirm, if the phrase from paragraph 2 and provide comments on development applications to protect trees of significance, the estimated cost per annum would drop from 60,000 to 20,000, is that correct?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Yes, that would be the case. So the estimated cost of establishing a committee or advisory group in that respect was really based around the frequency in which they would need to meet. And for us to be able to meet our statutory timeframes, which is either 60 or 90 days, this group would need to meet quite frequently. I would recommend at least once a month.
Any further questions? Councillor Coveney.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I believe the city recommends, in lieu of a committee, a group. Is that because of this motion, or if this motion wasn't put forward, would the city still be recommending that group? And if so, why? And if not, why?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Yes, we would still be recommending an advisory group over a formal committee of council. The only formal committee of council we have at the moment, as required by the Local Government Act, is Audit, Risk and Governance Committee. All of our other groups with particular focus areas such as community safety and advisory and public art are all advisory groups. They're not formal committees of council. And part of the reason that we tend to do that is it provides the opportunity for community members to discuss the topics in an informal setting. They're not making formal decisions on behalf of council because they're not an established committee for the purpose of the Act. So they don't have the ability to have a function or decision-making power of council delegated to them. So they can feed back their commentary and advice to the council, but it doesn't, they don't act in place of the council in making a decision. In terms of achieving a simple majority for decisions, given the varying views that are often found amongst the community in relation to particular topics, whilst a simple majority itself might be able to be achieved, there's often disagreement on the actual wording of the motion to be considered because everybody obviously has different views. Whereas if it's an advisory group, the officers can kind of capture the general sentiment of it, and if there is a consensus reached, provide that feedback back to council. And then also, obviously, as part of the report and on the agenda tonight is the remuneration as well. That's otherwise now required for formal committees of council. So there's an increased financial impact associated with creating this as a formal committee of council as opposed to an advisory group.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Mr Bradford?
I was just going to add, thanks Mr Mayor, I was just going to add that one of the advisory groups that I sit on at every meeting is the community safety one. And that is a really effective mechanism for bringing together various members of the community to have a pretty frank and open discussion on varied topics, and it works. And then its feedback feeds back into actions we take, the community safety plan and those sorts of things. And so I think that an advisory group provides a much more flexible way of getting feedback from the community in a way that is more effective in terms of informing council of its interests, and I'd use the community safety group as an example of that.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Mr Adams?
I'd just like to add from a governance point of view, part 2 of our standing orders is dedicated to the establishment and membership of committees. And it says that, well, the standing orders say that if you create a committee, then it needs to follow the standing orders. So you then put a whole lot of formality around it that may really impinge on the intent of the committee in the first place, in that you really need to have reports coming to the committee that need to be considered in the way that a council meeting's run, in essence. And I guess the other point is that the members of the committee would then have to abide by the obligations that we put on council members and committee members, whereas if it's an advisory group, I think there's more scope for informality in terms of the discussion, and there's more scope for more members of the community to be involved from time to time than if it's a set committee, because the other thing is that when you appoint to a committee, you appoint for a specific term that's tied to election cycles. So I think from a governance point of view, I don't think that what is wanting to be achieved would be best achieved by having the Committee of Council model in this instance.
Thank you, Mr Adams. Councillors, any further questions on this item? Councillor Choi.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So in terms of the proposed policy, has the city had a chance to look at the new Welga one, and is there any comments that can be made how that one might compare to what we have in front of us?
Ms Shaw, I think Councillor Choi is referring to the template policy.
Yes, that's right. Thanks, Mr Mayor.
Right. Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. We're actually part of the Urban Forest Subcommittee of the Tree Retention Subcommittee of Walga's Urban Forest Group, so we helped create the template. There's actually a few changes I would probably recommend just to ensure a South Perth context. And in speaking to Walga's planning manager, the intent of the template was for local governments to tailor, even though I know there has been a lot of commentary around consistency across different local governments in addressing this issue. But it was really intended to just be the base template for local governments to be able to pick up, review, consider if they needed to tweak any aspects of it, and then adopt. So if council proceeds with a local planning policy, we would review that in more detail to see if there were any further amendments for our context before bringing that back to council.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi.
Thanks through the Chair to Director Shaw. So I understand that the committee members would need to be paid. Do we have any idea how much that would likely be in the first instance?
Should I send that to Ms Shaw, Mr Adams, someone else?
Thank
Take
you,
it on
Mr. Mayor.
notice?
I believe it's 305. Yes.
All right. Councillor Choi.
Thank you through the Chair again to Director Shaw. And are there any implications for this for other city-supported advisory groups and reference groups who have non-elected members from the community on those?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I think it might be fair to say that the other advisory groups may seek to become formal committees of council, given the requirement now for remuneration. Beyond that, I don't think there are any further implications.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and again through the Chair to Director Shaw. So I'm just wondering, would it be prudent for any new group of this nature to not only be an advisory group or a reference group or a working group, whatever type of group you want to call it, but also to be a group made up of broader community voices, as has been discussed, such as an overarching environmental group that comprises of community representatives with specialist knowledge and interests in a range of environmental and sustainability issues, and who would undertake a holistic view of the city's environmental challenges now and into the future? Is this something the city would potentially support?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So the officer's suggested officer recommendation was in direct response to the content of the notice of motion itself. So our recommendation was that terms of reference would be created for an urban forest advisory group, but it would be open to council to instead create an environmental advisory group, for example. And if that was the case, we would draft terms of reference that addressed any matters that council is seeking that advisory group to consider.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Oh, Mr Adams.
So I think just on that point, my experience with advisory groups is that you are probably better off keeping the scope narrow so that you can remain focused on the areas that the advisory group is set up to address, and that if this one is specifically about urban forests, then perhaps keeping it to urban forests and tree issues across the city is probably a better way to go than trying to broaden it. And if the council wanted a specific environmental advisory group, then it would be up to council to set that up. And I guess with an advisory group, it's up to council to determine, how much weight they put on the recommendations that are coming from the advisory group, and how council wants to use that advisory group to inform their decision making. So that would be on council itself to, place whatever weight it wanted on those particular recommendations that were coming from that advisory group.
Thank you, Mr Adams. Mr Bradford?
I might be straying into Director and Primo's space here, but along those lines, my observation, I guess on the ground of our natural areas team is they have a really effective working relationship with a number of environmental groups, both on the foreshore and the southern part of the city, and at a really practical level, that works very, very effectively. It absolutely relies on the enthusiasm and hard work of the city employees, but certainly for the time I've been here, that's worked really, really well.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Any further questions, councillors? Councillor Coveney.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Is it fair to say that there would be a reputational risk to the city and council if an advisory group was established and made recommendations that weren't followed through by council?
Who should I send that to? Mr Adams?
I think the reputational risk would be more, I don't think you necessarily have to follow every recommendation that comes from an advisory group, but I think it would be, if you're having an advisory group, then the onus would be on council to properly consider the recommendations that were coming from the advisory group as part of the overall decision-making process.
Mr Bradford?
I might add that the city had a property committee of council that I think in its last iteration, every member of council was a member of the property committee, and that has since been disestablished. And it was quite common for the property committee to reach a decision, either unanimously or by the majority, that then was not followed through at council. And so, given that the membership was all of council, that seemed a bit odd.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Any further questions on this item, councillors? No. Okay. All right. That brings us to item 15. This is the item where we have to close the meeting to the public. So the questions that people wanted to ask about confidential attachments can be asked. So for those of you in the gallery, thank you for your attendance. For those of you listening via YouTube, thank you for listening. We will be back if you want to stay online, although we'll only be coming back to close the meeting after this, so it's up to you. But we will go into closed session now. So thanks for listening. guess we reconnect. Thank you, governance. Before I close this meeting, I'd like to thank everyone for their attendance and participation. I declare the meeting closed at 8:20 p.m. Thank you all and good night.